Hey, my name's Don Roscoe. I am a senior pastor of Grace Community Church in the state of Michigan, which is located in the northern part of the United States. It's great to be back at the Run-On Conference in the Philippines, a 2022 conference, in which you're all talking about disciple making. I've got many friends there in the Philippines with a national disciple making movement, wave makers, and a lot of others, maybe not affiliated with those key organizations, but a lot of other pastors and youth pastors. It's just good to be back with you and to talk with you about some practical application and implementation here in our follow-up to session 2. For 20 years, I served as an associate pastor working with both youth and adult ministries in a church before I planted the current church where I now serve for 29 years. The church I was at for 20 years was very conservative, very traditional church in all ways, in terms of theology, programming, their philosophy of ministry, and definitely had a wide set of church traditions that in some circles might be called sacred. The concept of being purposeful, being a disciple-making ministry, the ideas of ministry planning and evaluation in that early church I was at were haphazard at best and were really highly subjective. The scale of success was generally emotional. On one hand, how did it feel? How do we feel? And what do you give yourself a smiley face or a grumpy face or somewhere in between? So when I started the church where I'm currently serving, I took some steps to create an environment, an atmosphere, if you would, whereby intentional disciple making would be the priority. And in all facets of the ministry, we would be purposeful. The idea of being intentional, missional, and relational were building blocks, if you will, for the way that we designed our church. Earlier, Dan Spader mentioned that we have to settle on some matrix if we are going to determine health within our church. We have to have some objective standard that we're going to look at. So Dan talked about 2 metrics earlier, and we're going to revisit those and think in terms of application and also implementation, but in the sense of our own life, the lives of our church segments, if you will, such as youth ministry, home group, women's ministry, children's ministry, but the entire church as a whole. This will help us to keep disciple making as a priority. So Dan's session, he gave us 2 major metrics, and those have to be woven into every aspect of our church. They can't just be something that one ministry does, because one ministry is very simply a part of the whole. So it's kind of like if the right arm as opposed to the rest of the body. If you're right-handed, you can't just sit there and lift weights and build up that right arm, because it has to be engaged with the rest of your body parts. It wouldn't make much sense just to have one part of your body strong and the rest doing whatever they want to do. So the first metric that Dan talked about is the idea of conversion, especially he used the term conversion growth. And he suggested that there's primarily 2 different ways of growing a church. One is transfer growth, and the other is conversion growth. So transfer growth is simply a person coming from one ministry into another ministry. Conversion growth is somebody coming to faith and then growing within that ministry. But in reality, churches grow in a variety of ways. And a third key factor, and this is a global issue, is biological growth. I want you to just write that down if you would. There's transfer growth, conversion growth, and biological growth. And by biological growth, I simply mean that a church, if you want to grow, you attract a younger audience of maybe you would use the term constituency or parishioners. And by younger, it's not just an age thing, it's the ability to produce babies, if you will, the baby producing range. And that varies from country to country. But if you have a lot of younger people that are married and within, say, the age of 20 to even nearing 40, you're going to have a lot of babies that will increase the number of people within your church. But it's really no secret that in a lot of countries, the population of those countries, like the U.S., is aging. In many countries, their younger generations are waiting later to have children. Some of them are in their early 30s as they get through all of their education, so they don't have as many years to produce offspring. And it's no mystery that people are having fewer children, period. There used to be a time in the United States when a family could have 5, 6, 7 children. And Dan mentioned, I think, or Will mentioned the number of people the number of siblings that he had. That was the norm 50 years ago. But that's not the case any longer. So fewer children later in life, a more secular world culture has impacted the church, where life is all about me. So let's not have kids, let's enjoy life. All of those factors enter into this idea of biological growth. Biological growth in some countries and in some settings can work. You just go after younger people and they're going to grow your church. But that doesn't guarantee that people are going to become believers. And it doesn't guarantee that there'll be disciples who make disciples. It just means you can grow a church. And here's what we have to think about. So if you think of transfer growth, conversion growth, and biological growth, a church can grow in those areas, but they can also die or recede or shrink in those same 3 areas. I don't hear many people talking about that. Think of the area of transfer. Pastors want to grow their church. Why? Because many times, if we're honest, it's a business. It needs workers and it needs money. And then we all struggle with our ego. We want to have a bigger church than the guy down the street. That's pretty carnal, but that's the reality. Just as people can transfer in, they can transfer out. Think about it. Marriage. You'll lose many younger people when they fall in love and they date somebody and they go off to another church or another area to join that person in their congregation. Some people transfer out to be closer to family. Some transfer because of job change, some because of retirement, etc. You can grow a church by transfer. You can also see your church die by transfer. Pastors, be honest, we don't have very much control over any of those factors. Then there's conversion. Conversion is getting somebody saved and then growing into the church as a healthy believer. But on the other hand, there's what I call reversion. People who backslide, or that's a good Baptist term, or they fall away. The reasons could involve sin. It could involve a change of life priorities for a period of time. It could involve health, loss of a biblical fervency in your life. It could be having a fuzzy purpose. We all go through periods of time where we're trying to balance life priorities. Everything in the world is fuzzy, and we really no longer have a number one priority. And sometimes it's relational difficulties. People get their feelings hurt, and they maybe were a vibrant Christian, and so they just pretty much walk away from it or pout or suck their thumb, or they're honestly just hurt and they can't get beyond it. That's what I call reversion. And when that happens in a church, and again, pastors, you have very little control over any of those situations. When that happens, that doesn't just affect the person, it affects the ministry that they're involved in, and it affects those people who are friends with that person. So there's transfer out, there's reversion, and then biological. Just as people can be born into a church and grow up in the church, people die. And that's a reality. Again, pastors, you don't have any control over that unless you can raise the dead. And sometimes people are incapacitated by health reasons. They're now in a nursing home. They could be in a retirement community. And biologically, we would say of that person, their effectiveness within the church is dead because they're no longer physically or mentally able to participate. So think about that as we're talking about conversion growth and how to grow a church. Pastors also have to look at how is your church receding or declining. So keep your eye on those 3 areas. Transfer growth brings along many tag-along problems. We have to look at transfer growth. If we're getting a lot of people coming in via transfer, we've got to ask ourselves, why are they transferring? Where did they come from? How did they leave things there? Because most of the time, they will bring baggage with them. An old pastor here in the United States simply called this shuffling of the holy buns, and he patted his rear when he did that. They moved from church to church to church. We in leadership have to examine people when they come from another ministry. We've got to know, why did they leave and how did they resolve any issues they had in the prior ministry? And many times, folks, that means we have to call that church up and talk to the leadership there. People leave for reasons, and they're looking for something or they're running from something. You think of the area of biological growth. If there's a lack of biological growth, then that takes out about a third of the way that your church can grow. We as pastors, church leaders, have to continually be recruiting younger people because they can help grow a church. And many churches want that, but they're not willing to pay the price to get to know younger people because they come from a world that has changed their values and changed their theology or their understanding of what church is. So biological growth, we have to keep an eye on it. Just because babies are being born, in our church currently we're having a number of younger babies, that doesn't mean they're going to become productive disciples. We have to keep an eye on their development and on how people are parenting them. Lastly, it's the idea of conversion growth. That method of growth is truly biblical. It fulfills the mandate, the Great Commission, and it is what God blesses. I don't know in Scripture we see that He's blessing transfer growth or just the fact that babies are being born. All those are good. They contribute to numbers, but not necessarily to disciples. So as we evaluate our church with this first metric, the conversion growth, if you will, it's important that we do identify how many people are, as Dan talked about, crossing the line and putting their faith in Jesus. The subject of conversion growth is intriguing, but if you think about it, it can come across pretty mechanistic, and even some people have said it's a worldly system, if you will. And it can appear that way if it's not properly explained and instituted within our church and used. So I have taught this concept of conversion growth for many, many years around the United States and Canada and throughout Asia. And I've always encountered some common areas of concern, so I want to address those. If we're going to equip our people to be disciples who make disciples, then we have to be aware of what the mental imagery of conversion growth may say to someone else, or the thoughts that phrase can generate. So I'm just going to address three areas of concern and try to give you some food for thought, if you will. First area of concern, we need to question if we're going to use conversion growth and grow our church numerically, then it's the question of why. Why would we want to use a conversion growth percentage? It's the idea of the percentage is to allow us to set goals, faith goals in which God has to be active. We can't do a faith goal. Only God can do a faith goal. So it would be, here's an example. We want to see 15 people come to Christ this year. Well, that's a great goal, but that's a faith goal. We're depending on God to save people and bring them into the church. We really have very little to do with that. That's a faith goal. Then there are personal or work goals. Those are the things that we have some control over. For example, if my faith goal is to see 15 people come to faith and join the church at the end of the year, then I, as a work goal, will set out to share my faith with one person each week of this year. See, I have control over that. That's up to me. Whether people get saved or not is up to God. So that still doesn't answer the why in depth. It gives you an idea. It helps us to goal set. But the idea of goal setting is very important to a church because it allows us to strategically plan. It allows us to evaluate and allows a church to prioritize its resources, such as budget, staff, space within a church building, calendar dates, physical assets, and many other items. Because if we're trusting God to bring 15 people to faith this year and join our church, We need to be looking down the road a year and say, well, if 15 people do come to faith, because I'm sharing my faith once a week, 15 people come to Christ, what will that do for our church? What would the percentage increase be? What will that do for our children's ministry? Do we need to hire another staff person, part-time, full-time? Are we going to need more tables and chairs? Do we need to go to 2 services? When we have a goal for conversion growth, that forces us to think into the future, not just settle for who we are and what we've always been. It's not a corporate business plan at all. It's a way of putting our desires and those of God into print and then ingraining them into our lives and into our ministry and looking forward with a degree of godly anticipation. So why would we want to have or use conversion growth percentages? For all of those reasons. Here's a second area, second question that when people think about conversion growth, they begin to think about. Well, is this just about getting people saved? In some churches I've been in as a church consultant, they'll say, we don't even know any unbelievers outside of our own family. They're a church that used to be in a community that they were part of. Now the whole community has changed, maybe ethnically, maybe socioeconomic reasons, but they don't even know the people around them anymore. So the second area, the question is have our people been equipped to build redemptive relationships? Our church is not going to grow by conversion if we're not building relationships with the idea of seeing people come to faith. Many Christians are not regularly sharing their faith. Here's some statistics, and they haven't changed much in the last 20 years. 61% of Christians have not shared their faith in the last 6 months. We talk about it, we hear sermons about it. 61% of us have not shared our faith. 98% of Christians do not witness to non-believers on a weekly basis. Now, they may witness once a month, whatever, but it's definitely not a lifestyle issue. That's virtually all of us are not sharing our faith weekly. Another percentile, 95% of Christians have never led another person to God. You can't have conversion growth if people aren't coming to faith. So you've got to ask yourself, if I'm a pastor, I'm going to look at my church and just ask the question, this calendar year, how many people have come to faith? And then I'm going to say, well, who was responsible? Was it just the pastor that led these people to the Lord? Was it just 1 or 2 families that did? If so, what does that say about the congregation as a whole? Jesus called people into what we say within our training of wave makers and national disciple making movement and Sun Life. We refer to this as the ministry training phase. Jesus called people in Matthew 4:19. He said these words, "Follow me. I will teach you how to bring in people instead of fish." Now, you know a different version of that. I happen to like that version. Jesus saying, I'm going to help you. I've got to train you. I've got to make you. Why? Because it's not natural for us to do that. So have your people been equipped to build redemptive relationships? Jesus knew he had to teach them to do so, because the majority of them were fishermen. They weren't used to talking to others, especially Samaritans. They weren't used to talking to tax collectors or to Romans or to the higher-ups in the Jewish faith. Jesus had to model to them, how do you develop good conversational skills? Here's some tips. If you want to write some things down, these may end up in your notes. Here at our church, we try to help our people to be effective. So we have regular training events, such as our mentoring, one-on-one classes. We have a variety of college-type classes in which we teach people how to share their faith, how to build relationships, how to present the gospel. Our home groups, many of you have home groups, and even we have sermon series that are designed to help people build relationships with the lost. So we call those regular training events on your church calendar. I believe a church needs to provide 2 to 3 practical tools for their people to present the gospel. That could be something on your phone or your iPad. It could be some sort of app. It could be a written track. It could be something as simple as a wordless book. Many of you will know what that is. We've got to give our people some hands-on tools that they can have with them should the opportunity come, not only to share the gospel, but know how to ask good questions so that people think. People need help with conversational tips. I'm amazed. People are social, but they really can't carry on a conversation unless it's about themselves. So we have to teach people how to listen and how to ignite a conversation. And like Jesus asked many key questions. We have to teach our people how to do that. Another are some culturally acceptable techniques of presenting the gospel. Back in the old days, 30, 40 years ago, I used something called the Romans Road. If you're an older Christian, you'll remember what that is. Many of you use a single verse, Romans 6:23, to present the gospel. Those are techniques. The average Christian would like to share their faith, just they've never been taught how. They don't have anything simple that they can go to explain the gospel. This next month, in the month of July here at our church at Grace, I'm teaching on 5 weeks, what is the gospel? So that our people understand how to use 4 words to explain the gospel to somebody else. Another thing we can do is craft a personal testimony. Teach your people how to share their testimony in 2 to 3 minutes. And lastly, you can create targeted outreach events in which lost people will come to an event. Christians are then trained to share their faith. All of those are areas that answer the question, have our people been equipped to build redemptive relationships? And when we think about conversion growth, a third area is what is meant by our terminology. What is meant by our terminology? When you look at the material that Dan presented, he talks about how many converts came to faith, how many believers were involved in getting them come to faith, and he uses the phrase regular attending. Within our church ministries, we have to look at those words and then as an entire church come to an agreement. What do we mean by a convert? For some people, it's they said a prayer. Another group, they've raised a hand. Somebody else, they took a membership class. Another church would say converts are people who've been baptized. A church has to come to an agreement in their terminology. What do we mean by convert? What do we mean by regular attending? Because 8 to 10 years ago, regular attending in a church here in the United States meant you were in a church service 3 to 4 times a month. Today, it's 1 time a month you're considered a regular attending believer. And what do we mean by believer? What do they believe? Are you going to say your Sunday morning crowd are all believers? I don't think so. Some people say it's their Sunday night crowd, if they still have Sunday night. Some say it's only those who are members. A church has to define those terms before you attempt to do measuring of what your conversion growth percentage would be. Many people want to measure their church growth, but they bog down at this point and they cannot have a sense of unity. A church leadership team must determine, what do we mean by convert? What do we mean by believer? And what is regular attending? And then every ministry of the church has to buy into that terminology. That's the only way you get any sensible measurement. The second metric that Dan talked about is the idea of serving. And he used the idea of M1 through M5 as a process of growing a ministry mindset within your people. And that will be evidenced, Dan pointed out, by their service. As a pastor, I've struggled with the idea of having people serve within a church because I've noticed they serve for a wide variety of reasons. They serve to be recognized. They serve because no one else will. They serve because somebody asked them and they didn't know how to say no. They serve for personal significance. They serve to make friends, maybe business contacts. There's all kinds of motivations. So spiritual motivation is not generally the primary focus of a person's mind within our congregations today. Most people walk into church with a secular mindset. They're struggling to balance the cares of this world with the beliefs of the church and the beliefs of Christ. So they really struggle in this idea of serving because they come from a world where service may be a bad thing, where you're paid to serve. It's somebody else's job to serve. It's not my job description. And most churches struggle in getting people to serve because they're program driven and they require warm bodies to run those programs. So we just thrust people into positions without thinking through, where is this person in their spiritual maturity and where are they in terms of their giftedness? We have to ask why and where we would have somebody serve. Where do we want them to serve and why do we want them to serve? Just because they have a pulse? That's not generally a good reason to serve in a church. So we want people to serve out of giftedness and with a degree of passion. And here at our church, as in many of your churches, you may be familiar with Rick Warren's book on purpose-driven life and how he used the acrostic or the acronym SHAPE, S-H-A-P-E, for their spiritual giftedness, heart passion, natural abilities. That's the S, the H, the A. The P is personality style. And based upon their life experiences, that's the E. Well, here in our church, we have a course that we teach on the subject of SHAPE. That before people get into ministry, we have them take that course so we can see how God has wired them and what their expertise might be. We also give them a course called Here's Grace, because our church is called Grace, in which they learn about all the ministries of the church. They learn about the leadership of the church. They learn about the expectations of the church. The SHAPE course and the Here's Grace really go a long way to equip people to function well in church ministry, but also they help us as leaders to know the characteristics of the person, to know any problems that they may be dealing with, so that we can help them to be most effective. There are many things that you can do with your people to better equip them to serve, not just throw them into the meat grinder, if you will, of church ministry. So one of my observations over the years has been that most every churchgoer has some connection to their community. If you think about it, they have part-time jobs or two jobs, school functions they serve in, civic, government roles, community sports, drama, music, all sorts of events outside of the church. We want our people to serve in the church based upon their spiritual giftedness, but we also see the church service not as an end-all. This is a starting point to develop competency, to develop commitment, and to hone their skills, if you will, so that as they go out into the world, wherever God has led them or placed them, they are able to serve there and influence people, not just with their words, but with their lifestyle, so that they can show others that Jesus was a great servant and that Jesus means something to them. So we expect our people to serve both in the church and in their community. But I found that very few church people view their non-church life, if you will, with that perspective. They live in a dichotomy. There's a secular world and the church world. We as pastors have to help them to see that the secular world is we would say where they are expected to serve 40, 50, 60 hours a week with their job or while they're in school or in their neighborhood. That's where they really live out their Christianity. Church is only the practice field to develop the skills and attitudes and competencies to really impact the world around them. If you think of a garden behind a house, in a garden you have many rows of flowers or vegetables. Each may be different from the next, growing differently. Each has different needs. Each row requires differing care. Here's what I want you to think about, is our garden would be the world around us. The rows are various relational opportunities. The row of where we work, the row of our hobby, the row of our peer group, the row of our school. And we are the gardener. No gardener can walk out and take care of all of those plants in each row by himself. He has to start somewhere. But here's what we know. If you don't go out into the garden, those flowers, those vegetables, etc., are going to die. They're going to be overcome by the weeds, and they'll be worthless. You and I have to start somewhere. So we simply walk, if you will, to the window of our life, and we look out and say, look at all the rows that God has given me, an opportunity whereby I can make a difference. And you have to start somewhere. The key is to be intentional and careful wherever we start. And we have to pull out the weeds. We have to make the soil soft and moldable. We have to fertilize. We have to spend time. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 3 that we are the workers, but God gives the growth. As we serve in the church, as we serve in the community, we can only do what we can do, but we can do something, and we can start somewhere. So that may be in your own family, could be in a church home group, it could be in some ministry, it could be in the church itself, but ultimately God wants us to move from the house, if you will, out into the garden, out into the real world where lost people dwell. And in order to do that, we as church leaders have to begin to think differently and strategically in the areas of conversion growth and serving. Hope you've learned something that will be of help to you. All right, God bless.